Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about chemistry and identity. And all right, well, I was watching this video on YouTube of general ideas of chemistry because I've always kind of thought that like I don't really get chemistry. I think like out of all of the subjects that we see in high school, like math, physics, chemistry, I always think that chemistry is the hardest one for me to grasp. And I think it's because of the idea of the atoms and the molecules. Like, how does that, like when people talk about chemical reactions, are you literally like using a microscope the whole time and doing these chemical reactions? Or, and then I learned that there's this thing called moles, right? Which basically is the measurement proportionate at a microscopic level, but now kind of taken at a human perspective level, which they call it macroscopic. But anyway, I was learning about something or I was relearning or watching this part where they talk about, there are three states, right? Which is gas, liquids, and solids. And I guess there's a fourth one that I think throughout recent years they've developed more. The fourth one I think is plasma or something like that, which is a combination of gas and liquid, if I'm not mistaken, which is kind of like what is in the earth. I mean, in the sun, right? Like the sun irradiates or makes this plasma. I guess something like that with plasma. But anyway, I was seeing how solids are basically all of the atoms grouped together, neatly organized. And I guess this happens at very low temperatures, like if it's really cold. And I guess that's why water like freezes. And also, it's low entropy. So entropy is chaos, it's disorganization, right? It's a mess. But in this case, there's low mess because they're all neatly organized. And then the other extreme, obviously, are gases, right? And gases can basically fill up the volume in which they are put in, right? They are not very organized. They're disorganized, and especially when they're at high temperatures, excuse me, they are able to manifest high entropy, right, which is high chaos or high disorder. Now lately I'm going to join this together with another idea, and this is how we're going to kind of dive into the realm of identity. I've been thinking about this a lot, and you can see through my documentary reviews of the British Empire. I'm reading the book Homo Deus, I think, which talks about like the conquerors and the conquerees, right? Like the people that came to America, like the Europeans, the English, the Americans now, how they basically are the superpower of the world, right? And just this idea has been kind of like, I've been thinking about many things, right? Culturally wise, also, like the difference between men and women in the United States, the difference between men and women in Mexico, for example. How like the Mexican man is kind of like the American woman, and the Mexican woman is kind of like the American man. If you want me to make a video on that, I can get into that. I'm not going to do that right now. But this idea of like the people in the north, right? Like especially Russians, Europeans, and Americans, right? And how the people in the southern countries, right? Like all the people, I guess, like in India, Africa, like the islands of the Southeast Pacific, all of Latin America, starting with Mexico all the way down south, right? The cultural differences between those two, right? Like obviously there's the idea of the Aryans, and it's basically like a negative idea that says that the Aryans are the dominant race, and that they're industrious, and that they're here to basically conquer the rest of the cultures. They're here to civilize and modernize, right? That's what they were thinking when when the British invaded India and they conquered India. That was their mentality. That a lot of them thought that way. They thought, not all of them, but a lot of them thought, these guys are primitive and we're civilized, we're modern, so we're going to civilize these people, right? Bring religion, bring law, order, structure, right? So I was like, may that have anything to do with the geography of things, right? Like people in the north, we know, are more exposed to colder climates, colder temperature. And according to the chemical or the chemistry theory, it says that the atoms, or in this case, I would say the people are more organized if it's, and entropy is lower if the temperature is lower, right? So it would make sense. I mean, like currently right now we're in May, and I'm in Mexico, and it's very hot, right? So I think when you're hot, maybe you do tend to get disorganized, but you also tend to not want to do anything, because just moving around, like doing exercise, you're gonna sweat buckets, right? And if you live in colder temperatures or under colder climates, you are probably going to want to do things, right? Now, there's this idea of industrious, right? Like people in the north are more industrious. And I would say in part it could be because it's colder and they're more organized. But in another part, it could be, or on the other hand, it could be because since it's colder, you want to maybe move around and do things. Um, to kind of like heat up your body, right? Because if you live in southern countries, right, according to the equator in the world, I'm talking about like countries in Africa or South America, you're not gonna want to really move, right? You're not really gonna want to organize things, right? Because it's hot. So it may all just really boil down to temperature, right? Is the temperature high, then you're gonna be disorganized. Is the temperature low, then you're gonna have a proclivity to be organized, right? And I'm talking about centuries, millennia of cultures. I'm not talking about like just you as an individual. If you go from the north to the south or from the south to the north, your culture is gonna change. No, right? Like I'm talking about like the cultures that have been there for many years, right? So food for thought. That's just something to think about. And then, of course, let's not forget about the other state, liquid, right? So I think liquid is obviously the balance between solids and gases, right? So I would say maybe you want to be liquid, which means that you're able to take shape, right? You're able to be organized if you need to be, right? You're able to adapt to a certain volume, but then again, you're flexible enough, right? If you need to change, if you need to modify, if you need to transform yourself, right? Excuse me, you're able to do that. Um, okay, now there's this other idea and this question of what are your impulses and what are your defenses, and what are your subliminations and what are your capacities. Now, this is kind of tied in to the type A, type B personalities, where type A, which we know is a very active personality, would maybe need to answer the questions, what are their defenses? Like if you need to be in a passive state of mind, like how can you protect yourself, right? Because obviously type A personality have many impulses, they're doing things, right? But what are your defenses? And vice versa. If you're a type B personality, you have a lot of defenses, right? But what are your impulses? What are your drives? What are your motivations, right? Same thing with sublimations and capacities. If you, for example, are a type A personality, you probably have a lot of capacities. You do things, but you probably don't have a lot of subliminations, which are hidden things, right? And if you're type B, you probably have a lot of subliminations, a lot of hidden things, but what are your capacities, right? Like, what are you actually doing? What can you do well? Now, this idea, I was thinking about this. There's a stereotype that rich people, especially people that are born into wealthy families, tend to be lazy, right? Like I was watching the Gentleman series on Netflix, and one of the brothers has always been around, right? The other brother goes off to the military, and he obviously has a different mindset. But the older brother stays at home, very wealthy, and he's just irresponsible, right? So I think that's the stereotype of rich people. Now, I was thinking, because I heard about Leonardo da Vinci and how he was a polymath. He was good at everything, basically, at music, at science, right? Many things. And I'm like, how do you get to that level without like having to work, right? Or how do you make money? How do you do like your day job and still have time to learn all these things? So I was thinking maybe it could be because they're rich, right? So this made me think about, like, I'm not sure if Leonardo da Vinci was wealthy or came from a wealthy family, but just imagine this, like a person born into a wealthy family taking advantage of all the resources that they have, right? Learning about all, like, like if a person had a high IQ that was born into a wealthy family, man, like, and just imagine a bunch of people like that. I think they exist, but we don't know about them, but we should. They're the real. They have the external factor covered, right? Money, and they have the internal factor covered, which is their mind. So here's the identity update. The identity update asks the question, who are you, right? And I was reading Erik Erikson's biography on the developmental psychology, his stages, right? And I came across a definition that was more concrete to identity, because as we know nowadays, it's very common to have an identity crisis. So the definition is that your identity needs to be unity and continuity. Unity means that you're able to adapt the things that you have done in the past, or who you were in the past, who you are now, and who you want to be or will be in the future into one. That's a unity. And continuity means that you're able to project this obviously into the future, right? So the real question is not who are you. The real three questions are, who were you, who are you, and who will you be, right? That's the identity update of this video, because I know that the typical question is, who are you, right? But this is getting deeper. Who were you in the past? Who are you now? And who will you be in the future? To kind of have that unity, continuity definition applied to the identity update, right? Now, yeah, this is because there is an identity crisis. Oh, yeah. And the expectations that you have for the continuity for your future self need to be realistic. And this is going to be based on the situational opportunities available to you. So you can't say like, oh, I'm going to be rich, when the situations aren't really presenting themselves to you, right? The opportunities. So you need to take that into consideration, obviously, for your future, right? Like realistically measurable, right? Like the SMART goals. I think they're measurable. They have a time limit, right? All these characteristics. Realistically, what can you achieve in the future, right? What type of person can you be in the future, right? Your ideal you, your real you, and your ideal you don't have to be that far apart, right? In order for you to just have a little drive, right? Because if they're really far apart, like I'm poor and I plan to be rich, you're gonna feel frustrated, right? It has to be like, I'm poor and I just want to be a little bit wealthy, right? Or maybe middle class, right? Realistic. Okay. And in this case, the only way, the solution to an identity crisis, the only way to know who you are is through the action or through the meditation process of reflection, right? And you must update this every time you have a major change or you have a crisis, or just after some time, right? Like you knew who you were 5 years ago, you were very sure of yourself, but update that, right? Like ask yourself these questions. Who was I? Who am I? Who will I be? Right? And update it, because after some time it gets outdated, right? And you need to update it basically. So yeah, this is why people travel. When people say, I'm going on a spiritual journey, or I want to travel to different countries just to find myself, right? What they're really saying is, I need to think, right? And I found this to be funny because you can just do this in your own house, right? So what you need to do is take the time to self-reflect, to ask yourself these questions, answer them in a profound manner, and really get to know who you are, right? And kind of fit in those areas of your life from the past, from the future, that are kind of incoherent to who you think you are, right? Yeah, and all of this is tied into values, because you need to know what your values are before you can go to the objectives, right? People will talk about objectives, and I have done this mistake. You need to have objectives in life. But before you have objectives, especially if you have an identity crisis, you need to have values. You need to know what your values are, right? You need to ask yourself, what do I value? And from your values, you naturally get your objectives, right, for the future. And this all boils down, and I want to conclude with this, to knowing what to do, right? As a human species, we can do a lot of thinking, but at the end of the day, what we really want to get to are actions, right? But we need direction. We need to know where we're headed, right? What we're going to do, how we're going to do it, right? So in order to do that, you need to think, right? You need your mind, but then you need to go ahead and do what it is you need to do, right? Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and that's all I got for this one. So I'll see you guys next time. All right, peace.